Today we're slinging poison and status effects at enemies in this deflect focus kind of mage build, but kind of not sort of thing.
Stinky!
I don't know, it's a build and it's fun and I think you'll like it. So just watch the video, okay? Thanks. All right, let's go. Let me know in the comments your favorite weapon and maybe I'll make a build with it. So this build, as mentioned, is a poison status effect build, but it's also kind of this deflect build, and I wasn't really sure how to describe it, I guess, but it really is a poison kind of focus build. So essentially the way this build works is we're applying multiple status effects to the enemy and then using the damage increase you get from the Libationer Guo set, which will increase your damage to enemies that are afflicted by negative status effects by 12%. Now, because of this and the way the set kind of stacks with metal, and we're using the Night Arcane to complete this set, which also stacks with metal and water, I've combined this build to make this like metal water build that is a mage build masquerading as something else. So we are using Venom Snare, which will deal damage over time by applying poison to enemies. I'm also using Life Wither to increase the damage that they take. Thorny Ground also applies the slow effect to enemies to kind of keep them away from you. So essentially the way that most of these encounters go is I'm just slinging Venom Snare, Life Wither, and Thorny Ground at the enemies and keeping my distance, and then when they put pressure on me, I'll just deflect their attacks, especially their big critical hits, because we want to break down that spirit gauge and then follow up with a fatal strike. Now, one of the benefits of the poison stat in general is that it will gradually decrease the enemy's HP and their spirit gauge, so it makes it significantly easier to follow up with a fatal strike. And then because rather than attacking, I'm focusing on deflecting to replenish my spirit gauge, because using spells will diminish your spirit gauge and then you need to either attack or deflect to get it back. And by focusing on deflecting, we then keep chipping away at that spirit gauge so we can follow up with a fatal strike. And when we fatal strike with this Libationer set, you apply power drop and damage amplification to the target as well. So more status effects that you're applying to that target. And essentially that's really it. You just deflect all the attacks, let the poison do its thing, and then when you can fatal strike, you fatal strike, deal as much damage as you can with that, and then just keep rinsing and repeating, and you will have great success. This is the only build that I've beaten that like BS encounter with Shangpei that has the 3 different enemies that are just super aggressive and just constantly attack you. This build became kind of out of my annoyance of not being able to beat that encounter. So I wanted to make a defensive kind of build that also did damage that allowed me to beat that encounter. And this is kind of what I ended up with. And then I beat that encounter. So I think this build works and I think it's fun and I've been using it ever since and it is quite good. So let's break down the spells. Now we did touch on Venom Snare, which is a throwable like poison cloud that will deal damage over time to the target once you do apply poison. You really want to be applying poison to that target kind of as soon as possible. So make sure you are doing this. We're also using Life Wither to increase the amount of damage that they take. It's another debuff that you get on them. Thorny Ground, which we mentioned, which puts like a cone in front of you, which will slow the enemies when they hit. It also gives you a bit of a protective barrier to kind of keep them away from you. Now, these are the main spells that I'm using, but I also like Aqua Blink in this build, mainly for that Shangpei fight, to be honest, but also because it gives you the option to really control where you are on the battlefield, which dodging just doesn't really do in Wo Long. You never really want to be dodging. This allows you to control your positioning and get away from enemies so you can keep applying those status effects until it's time to get in close and deal those fatal strikes. There's some other options in spells here that I do like, but they're not necessarily part of the main kit. Molten Calamity Thorn is one of them. Now this will deal heaps of damage if you can hit the target. So what this does is if you hit the target that has these status effects on them, it will trigger all these status effects and deal additional damage corresponding to the number of ailments cured. So this is a massive damage hit, but the thing is, it is such a slow wind up that most enemies move too quick, and by the time you get this off, they're going to either interrupt you or just be out of the way. Venomous Discharge is a low morale rank option for this. So say, early in these encounters when you don't have a high morale rank, I would run Venomous Discharge instead of Venom Snare just for those reasons, as well as Thorn Shot instead of Thorny Ground. This is like a cheaper version of Thorny Ground that you can run for those exact same reasons. Now, as some other options, you've also got access to like all the water spells, so you could run the chill effect here as well if you wanted to. And with a tiny investment in fire, you could get access to amplified damage to increase your damage overall as well. For the Divine Beast for this build, we're focusing on Ten Shui, which is basically the only like mage focused Divine Beast. Now this gives you additional wizardry spell damage as a passive. It also gives you power drop on the enemy as another status effect that's just applied by hitting them with a spell. When you trigger this effect, it does also apply toxic damage as well as a bunch of ailments to the target, which is just kind of fits perfectly into what we're doing with this build. For the virtues, we're focusing on metal for the poison that we already discussed, getting this up as high as possible around the 50 to 60 mark is important, and then going into water because it scales perfectly with the Night Arcane that we're using, as well as getting access to Aqua Blink and those other water spells. For your equipment, we are using the Libationer Guo set, which I won't cover again because we've already covered it, but we are using the Night Arcane as kind of the main weapon. I do really like the martial arts on this weapon, specifically the first one, the Nightbird Spin. It just throws the stuff out. It allows you to keep that distance while dealing damage from that little bit of ranged. Your secondary weapon doesn't really matter too much as we're not really using a whole lot of melee weapons here. It's really just that Fatal Strike triggering that we're doing for the most part. For your ranged weapons, it really doesn't matter too much, again, for the same reasons. You could run a ranged weapon here, but really you want to focus on those special effects and make sure they are consistent with the build that you're looking for. And speaking of those special effects, the main things we want here are things like increasing the negative effect duration on enemies, or damage to enemies with negative effects, or toxic attack power, things like that that focus on either poison or damage dealt or wizardry spells, that sort of stuff. Your accessories are exactly the same. You just want to focus on those secondary effects and hitting that wizardry spell damage or toxic effects, those sort of things. As an early game alternative, or potentially even just an alternative to this build, as I think it does work in exactly the same way, is using the Tenshao Hermit set. All you have to do is become a Sworn Brother with Hongqin, one of the first allies you get, and that's super easy to do, and she'll give you this set as well as her staff, so you can basically just have this build right from the get-go. The set bonus for this set, especially the third tier power gain, so to the user you'll add power gain, which gives you additional damage dealt to enemies, so really valuable there. It also helps with your wizardry spell usage, so if you want to lean a bit more into the mage line, then I'd be wearing this set, and then maybe switch to the Liberator set if you want to, or just even stick with this set, as both really work with this build in a really fresh and interesting way as something unique to do in Wo Long. Some quick tips for this build. Firstly, let's talk about patience, and I think that's one of the most important things about this build. I guess in general a little bit Wo Long as well as deflecting, but patience is really important for this build. Kind of like the opposite of my Flaming Demon build that we did the other day, where that build is just constant attacking. This build is much more slower paced and focusing on applying those status effects. Deflecting attacks is your primary way of getting your spirit gauge back and then dealing those fatal strikes, and the patience is really important, I think, and just working on deflecting those attacks and balancing your aggression will see you have a huge amount of success with this build, and just in general with these kind of setups. It's also really good for bosses because of that ability to keep that distance with something like Aqua Blink and deal damage from ranged with these status effects and keep enemies away from you. And applying those status effects is the most critical thing, and whether you're doing it via the Wizardry Spells, or even if you have some of those passives that apply on martial arts, because we do have a solid martial art on our main weapon, you could use that as well as another alternative. It's really up to you, and as long as you're applying those effects and then following up with damage in any particular way, you will see a lot of success with this kind of status focused build, which I really enjoyed throughout my playstyle. When you're opening fights as well, you want to kind of open with Thorning Ground, as it doesn't necessarily trigger the fights as long as you can keep a bit of a distance from them. Start with that and then hit them with Life Wither, and then follow up with Venom Snare or whatever poison spell you're using, because Life Wither will then increase the damage that they will take from that. And that's kind of the general flow of those attacks, is just keeping those status effects active. Go and check out some of my other builds if you haven't already. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is NorZZa, and I hope you have a great day.